Eleanor had always known that life in the woods wasn't for everyone. For her, though, it had become everything. It wasn't a choice made overnight. It had taken years to build the cabin, to grow used to the stillness that sometimes felt like a weight on her chest. The cabin was small, just big enough for a bed, a stove, and the little wooden table she'd made with her own hands. The walls, lined with old weathered boards, creaked in the wind, and the small window at the front gave a clear view of the wild forest, stretching far beyond her reach. She lived alone now. It had been that way for years. Her husband, a man who had loved the quiet just as she did, had passed away quietly in the night, leaving her with only memories and the cabin. He had always joked that they should have a bigger house. One day, he had said, we'll build a place big enough to fit the both of us in the mountain air. But he never lived to see that day. So it was just Eleanor now, alone with her thoughts, the wind and the sound of the animals outside. She was at peace with it. Or at least that's what she told herself every morning. The life she had now was enough. She didn't need much. Her small garden kept her fed in the summer, and she had enough wood to last through the winter. The goats she kept were quiet companions, and the days passed slowly without the rush of the outside world. On this particular evening, the wind was stronger than usual. The trees outside groaned under its force, their limbs swaying in unison like dancers caught in a storm. Eleanor had long stopped being afraid of the storms. She had learned to respect them, but they no longer frightened her. She had weathered so many over the years. Her cabin had been built to endure just like her. The fire in the small stove crackled, filling the room with warmth. She was sitting at her table, stitching a small tear in her coat, when she heard a sound at the door. It was a soft, hesitant knock. Eleanor froze for a moment, unsure if she had heard it at all. She put down her needle and stood up, walking to the door with slow, deliberate steps. The knock came again, louder this time. She opened the door, and there he was, a man standing in the rain, drenched to the bone. His clothes clung to him, and his face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. He looked like someone who had been walking for a long time, but had just stumbled onto something unexpected. "Please," he said, his voice rough. "Can I come in? I've lost my way in the storm." He cut himself off, eyes flicking nervously to the dark woods behind him. "I don't think I can make it much further." Eleanor hesitated. She wasn't used to strangers, let alone letting them into her small space. The quiet was something she had come to depend on. The solitude gave her a sense of control over her own life. She didn't need anyone. She wasn't sure she even wanted anyone, but the storm was raging, and something in the man's voice told her that he didn't have much time. "Come in," she said finally, stepping aside. The man stumbled in, pulling off his wet jacket and shaking his head to clear the rain from his hair. Eleanor closed the door behind him and went to the stove to tend to the fire. It was a small gesture, but it made the cabin feel warmer. He didn't say anything right away, just stood there, shivering. Eleanor didn't ask questions. She didn't have to. She had seen enough hardship in her life to recognize when someone needed help without words. "You look like you've walked a long way," she said after a moment, her voice calm but direct. The man nodded, rubbing his hands together. "I'm not sure where I am. I was with a group hiking through the pass, but I got separated. The storm came out of nowhere, and I couldn't find them. I think I've been walking in circles." Eleanor glanced at him, taking in his worn boots and the tired look in his eyes. He wasn't much older than her son would have been had he lived. She didn't ask about his family or why he was out here alone. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. The storm outside seemed to swallow everything, and in the silence between them, the weight of it filled the room. "Well," she said, breaking the silence, "you're here now. That's what matters." She gestured to the small wooden chair by the table. "Sit. I'll get you some tea." He sat down gratefully, dropping his backpack on the floor beside him. "Thank you," he said softly, looking around the cabin with something like wonder. It's nice in here, simple." Eleanor didn't respond. She had heard that kind of compliment before. The cabin wasn't fancy, but it was hers. She had built it with her own hands, piece by piece. It had a history, a life of its own. She didn't feel the need to explain that to him, though. It wasn't something that needed explaining. She made the tea and handed him a steaming cup. He took it with both hands, nodding his thanks. "You've been living out here a long time, haven't you?" he asked after a moment. His voice had a soft edge to it, like someone trying to figure out the right thing to say. Eleanor nodded slowly. Too long, maybe, but it suits me. You've got everything you need, he said, glancing around. You've made a life for yourself. She looked at him then, her eyes narrowing slightly. You think so? He met her gaze without flinching. Yeah, I do. She thought about it for a moment. Maybe she had made a life for herself in her own way. Maybe it wasn't perfect, but it was hers. It had to be enough. It always had been. She turned away, tending to the fire again. The man seemed content to sit there in the quiet, sipping his tea. They didn't need to talk much. There was something comforting about the silence. But just as she was about to turn back to her needlework, he spoke again, his voice quiet, almost to himself. You know, you're bigger than this cabin. Eleanor stopped, her hand mid-motion. She didn't turn to face him, but the words hung in the air. She wasn't sure what he meant, but she felt something stir inside her. She didn't need to ask. She knew he wasn't talking about the size of the space. It was something else, something deeper. Bigger? She asked finally, her voice low. He nodded, looking down at the cup in his hands. Yeah, you've built all this, but you're bigger than the space you're in. There's more to you than this cabin. Eleanor didn't know how to respond. His words made something inside her twist, but she couldn't place it. For a long time, she had convinced herself that this cabin, this small, simple life, was all she needed. But now, for the first time, she wondered if maybe there was more to her than just the cabin, more to life than the walls she had built around herself. The man didn't say anything more. He finished his tea in silence, and Eleanor went back to her sewing, trying to ignore the strange feeling his words had stirred up. It wasn't the first time someone had spoken kindly to her, but for some reason, this time felt different. As the fire crackled in the hearth and the storm raged outside, Eleanor sat back in her chair, her hands still. The cabin seemed smaller somehow. The walls, once so familiar, now felt like they were closing in. She wasn't sure what she was supposed to do with that feeling. She wasn't sure if she even wanted to. But for the first time in years, she felt something stir in her chest. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. And as the night stretched on, Eleanor found herself wondering what it would be like to step outside the small, familiar life she had made for herself. The storm outside had slowed by morning, but the air was still heavy and wet. Eleanor woke to the quiet drip of rain from the roof and the soft, steady breathing of the man who had stayed the night. She didn't expect him to be there when she opened her eyes. Somehow it felt less lonely knowing he was nearby. The man was sitting on the edge of the bed, pulling on a dry shirt Eleanor had left out for him. He looked better than the night before, though tiredness still clung to his face like a shadow. Eleanor watched him for a moment, unsure what to say next. He looked up and caught her eye. "Thank you," he said softly. "For letting me stay," Eleanor nodded. "You would have been caught out there if you hadn't come here." He smiled faintly but said nothing more. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was quiet, comfortable in a way Eleanor hadn't known she missed. After a few minutes, the man stood and stretched. "I should try to get back on the trail soon. The storm passed, but the paths might still be dangerous." Eleanor moved toward the door and paused. "Do you want some food before you go?" "I have eggs and bread." He looked surprised but grateful. "That would be good." "Thank you." She busied herself preparing a simple breakfast. Eggs fried in the small cast-iron pan, bread toasted over the fire. The smell filled the cabin and seemed to bring life back into the small space. They ate in silence at first. The man watched Eleanor move around with quiet respect, like he was seeing a piece of the world he hadn't known before. "Your goats are quiet this morning," he said suddenly, nodding toward the corner where a few small animals lay curled up. Eleanor smiled, a small light in her eyes. "They're gentle. I like that." He nodded and looked out the window where the woods stretched endlessly. It must be hard sometimes living so far away. Eleanor didn't answer right away. She looked down at her plate and then back up at him. "Sometimes, but mostly it's peaceful." He thought about that for a moment, then spoke again. "I've never been this far from town before. I always thought the woods were too quiet, too empty, but maybe they're not." Eleanor's eyes softened. "There's a different kind of life out here. Not easy, but real." They talked more, the conversation slowly opening like a flower after a long winter. The man told her about his work. He was a hiking guide who knew the mountains well, but this time the storm had taken everyone by surprise. He had been separated from his group, and for hours he had wandered alone, unsure which way to go. Eleanor listened, remembering the days when she and her husband had walked similar paths, exploring the same forests. It was strange to think how the woods had changed for her from a place of adventure to a place of solitude. "You've been through a lot," Eleanor said gently. He nodded. "Yeah, it's been a tough year. Lost my brother a few months ago. Didn't know how to handle it. That's part of why I was guiding that group, trying to get away." Eleanor's heart tightened. She didn't say anything, just looked at him with quiet understanding. Grief was a strange companion, one she knew well. For a long time they sat together without speaking, each lost in their own thoughts. The cabin seemed smaller now, but somehow warmer. At one point, the man got up to check the small stove. "Your fire's good," he said, turning back to her. "You must be good at this." Eleanor smiled faintly. "It's what keeps me going." He looked at her then. Really looked. "You're stronger than you know." She didn't know how to answer that, so she stayed quiet. Later, he stood near the window, watching the trees still dripping with rain. "I should head out soon," he said. Eleanor walked to the door and opened it. The air smelled fresh but cold. The storm had left the world washed clean and the sky was beginning to clear. Before he left, he turned back to her. "I won't forget this place," Eleanor nodded. "You're welcome back any time." He smiled, then stepped into the woods, his figure slowly disappearing among the trees. Eleanor watched him go, feeling something she hadn't expected, a strange mix of hope and sadness. The cabin felt less like a prison now and more like a starting place. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, taking a deep breath. For the first time in a long time, she wondered what might come next. The days after the stranger left were quieter than usual in the little cabin. Eleanor found herself thinking about him more than she expected. His words echoed in her mind, the ones about being bigger than her cabin. At first, she had brushed them aside like leaves blown by the wind. But they settled deep inside like seeds waiting to grow. Her routine stayed the same. She woke with the dawn, tended to her garden, fed the goats, and stacked firewood. The woods around her were alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. But inside Eleanor, a storm had begun, a gentle stirring of something she had not felt for many years. She found herself sitting longer by the window, watching the sunlight dance through the branches. Sometimes she would close her eyes and remember the stranger's face, tired, kind, full of questions he didn't ask aloud. She wondered if he had made it back to safety. She wondered if he thought of her as much as she thought of him. One afternoon, she heard a faint knock on the door. Her heart skipped. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened it, she saw him standing there again, carrying a small bag and wearing a smile that seemed warmer than the morning sun. "I thought I'd come back," he said simply. Eleanor stepped aside to let him in. The cabin felt smaller with two people, but it no longer felt empty. He set down his bag and looked around as if seeing the cabin with fresh eyes. "I brought some tools," he said. "I want to help with the roof before winter." Eleanor was surprised but nodded. That would be good. The days that followed were different from the lonely years she had known. They worked together, fixing the shingles, clearing the gutters, and reinforcing the walls. The work was hard, but the company made it easier. They talked as they worked, sharing stories of their lives. The man told her about his brother, how he had loved the mountains too, but had been taken too soon. Eleanor listened with quiet sympathy, remembering her own loss. "You don't have to carry it all alone," she said softly one evening, after the fire had died down. He looked at her, surprised by the kindness in her voice. "It feels like I do." "You don't," she said firmly. "Sometimes sharing the burden makes it lighter." That night, Eleanor slept better than she had in years. The cabin no longer felt like a cage, but a home where walls could be built not just of wood, but of trust and understanding. In the weeks that followed, they settled into a quiet rhythm. He would visit when the weather allowed, bringing small gifts, a jar of honey, a book he found in town, a bundle of wildflowers. Eleanor would make extra stew or bake bread, saving some for him. Slowly, the cabin began to change, not in size, but in spirit. The small table seemed less bare, the air less still. It was as if the walls themselves had begun to breathe. One day, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the trees, he turned to her and said, "You were right. I'm not as strong as I thought. But being here, it helps." Eleanor smiled, feeling a warmth she hadn't known was missing. Sometimes strength comes from letting others in. They sat together in silence, the sky turning pink and gold above them. The woods whispered around the cabin, telling stories of the past and promises of what might come. Eleanor thought about the future, not as a distant dream, but as something she could touch with her own hands. The cabin was still small. The forest still vast, but for the first time, she felt ready to step beyond the walls she had built. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't so alone after all. The morning after their latest visit, the air felt different. Eleanor woke up feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time, a small flicker of hope. The cabin, though still small and quiet, no longer felt like a place to hide from the world. It was a place where something new could begin. She moved around slowly, her hands busy with familiar chores. The goats needed feeding, the fire needed tending, and the garden needed care. But even as she went about her day, her thoughts kept drifting back to the man who had come to her door that stormy night. The man who had shown her that there was more beyond the wall she had built around herself. When the afternoon light filtered through the window, she heard a sound she had come to expect. A soft knock at the door. Opening it, she saw him standing there again, carrying a small pack and wearing the same tired but warm smile. He had promised to come back once the trail was clear, and he had kept his word. Eleanor stepped aside, letting him in. The cabin felt a little fuller now, the air warmer. They spent the day fixing the roof, patching up weak spots, and clearing away fallen branches. The work was hard, but their movements matched, silent in understanding. At one point, as they rested against the wall, the man spoke softly. "I've been thinking a lot since I first came here. About loss, about what it means to keep going." Eleanor nodded. "Loss stays with us, but it doesn't have to hold us." He looked at her, eyes searching. "How do you keep going when it feels like everything is gone?" She thought about that, then said quietly, "By holding on to the things that still matter, by letting the small things grow." They talked late into the evening, the cabin glowing with firelight and quiet conversation. Eleanor found herself sharing stories she hadn't told anyone in years. About the husband she lost, the dreams they had, and the life she built after. He listened without judgment, his presence a steady comfort. When the fire burned low, he stood and said, "Thank you for letting me be here." Eleanor smiled softly. "You're welcome any time." The days passed like that, simple and steady. They shared meals, stories, and silences that felt full instead of empty. The cabin, small and weathered, seemed to breathe with new life. One morning, Eleanor made an unexpected decision. She packed a small bag with essentials, a warm coat, some food, and a journal she hadn't touched in years. She was going to town, just for a day. When the man heard her plan, he smiled. "I can come with you if you want." She shook her head. "No, I need to do this on my own. But thank you." The trip to town was strange and new. Eleanor felt both nervous and alive. She bought seeds for her garden, some tea, and a notebook to write down thoughts that had been locked away too long. When she returned, the cabin seemed different, like a bridge between her old life and something new. The man was waiting on the porch, and when she told him about her trip, he smiled. "You're changing," he said. "Maybe," Eleanor replied, looking out at the forest, "but I think that's okay." Together they watched the sun set, the sky painting colors across the trees. The cabin was still small, the forest still vast, but Eleanor felt ready to face whatever came next. For the first time in a long time, she believed that maybe the cabin could hold more than just storms. The leaves had started to turn, summer was slipping away, and the edges of the forest were painted in shades of gold, amber, and red. The mornings were colder now, and Eleanor had begun wearing her thick sweater again, the one with the stretched sleeves and worn cuffs she'd had for years. The man had continued to visit, but it was never every day. He had his own life beyond the woods, his own work and people. Yet every time he returned, it felt like he was bringing a little bit of the world back with him, and leaving behind some of its noise and rush. With each visit, the silence of the cabin felt more like peace and less like loneliness. Eleanor no longer woke up dreading the empty quiet. She had things to look forward to now, little things. Letters left in a basket by the front door. Conversations over tea. Evenings spent on the porch without needing to say anything at all. One morning, she found him already outside, mending the fence near the goat pen. She stood at the window and watched for a moment Bifo. "Re-stepping out, you always just show up and get to work?" she asked, smiling slightly. He shrugged. "Figured I'd beat you to it today." They laughed. It was light and easy. Later, as they sat near the porch eating the bread she had baked, he looked out toward the trees and said, "I don't know what this place is to me exactly, but it feels like something good." Eleanor looked at him, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "It's a place that holds people if they let it." He turned toward her. "It holds you?" "Yes," she said softly. "It does. But I think I was the one holding on too tight." The wind moved through the trees, soft and low. The forest seemed to breathe with them. She watched him as he pulled something small from his coat pocket. Just a folded piece of paper. "I wrote this a while ago," he said. "Didn't know if I'd ever give it to you." He handed it over and she opened it slowly. It was a simple note, just a few lines. Words about grief, about how sometimes the quiet helps us hear what we've buried. Words about her cabin, and how in its stillness he'd found something he didn't know he needed. Eleanor folded the note back up and held it gently in her lap. She didn't say much, just nodded. She understood. That evening, after he had gone, she sat by the fire and pulled out her old carving knife, the one she hadn't used in years. She walked to the front door and just above the frame began carving slowly, carefully. The wood was stubborn in places, but she was patient. By the time she finished, the sun had dipped low and her hands were aching. She stepped back and looked at the words, strong enough to hold more than storms. She didn't cry, though something stirred behind her eyes. It wasn't sadness, not really. It was the feeling of something being released finally, after years of keeping it locked inside. Over the next few weeks, she began writing again. Small notes, thoughts, bits of memory. She kept them in a jar on the shelf. When the man returned, she would read him one or two, and they would talk about them over breakfast. He kept his promise and came before winter. They stacked firewood, sealed the windows, and checked the roof one more time. The cabin was ready. So was she. Snow came late that year, and when it did, it came gently. Eleanor stood outside as the first flakes fell, her face tilted toward the sky. She stayed out there until the ground began to turn white, then went back inside and lit the fire. The man didn't stay all season. He had to return to the world beyond the trees. But he promised to write, and she believed him, and he did. Letters came folded neatly, full of stories and thoughts. Sometimes they made her laugh. Sometimes they made her sit quietly for a while. She always answered. It gave her something to look forward to in the long winter nights. The cabin didn't feel small anymore. Or maybe it was, but it held more now. More stories, more voices, more heart. Eleanor still lived simply, grew her food, fed her animals, kept to herself. But she didn't feel invisible anymore. Spring came slowly, but it came. The snow melted. The goats gave birth. The garden began to wake up. One morning, Eleanor opened the door and found a new letter waiting in the basket. It read, "I'm coming back soon. I hope you'll still have tea waiting." She smiled, folded the note, and placed it in the jar with the others. Later that day, she sat on the porch and looked out at the trees. The sun was warm on her face. The air smelled like earth and new life. Somewhere in the distance, a bird was singing. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't need to. For now, this moment was enough. The cabin was still the same. Small, quiet, worn around the edges. But now, it held something it hadn't before. It held her, and that was everything. The days had grown longer again, and the forest had turned green and full. The cold had passed, and spring had settled in gently, wrapping everything in softness. The cabin stood the same as always, quiet, still, familiar. But the feeling inside it had changed completely. Eleanor no longer measured time the way she used to. Before, the days were counted in chores and seasons and moments of silence. Now time moved in conversations, in letters tucked in the door basket, and in the sound of laughter echoing softly from the porch. The man had returned just as he said he would, not with noise or grand words, just a quiet knock and a calm smile. He carried stories in his eyes, and she welcomed him back like she would the warmth of spring. They worked together again, fixing, planting, cleaning up the mess winter always left behind. But it wasn't just about chores anymore. It was about what they were building together, even if it wasn't spoken out loud one morning. They sat across from each other at the small table, sharing breakfast and watching steam rise from their mugs. He set his mug down slowly and said, "You know, I never thought I'd come back here after that storm. But something kept pulling me." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes steady. "Sometimes the right places don't let you go." He nodded. "This place. It's not just your cabin anymore. It feels like home too." The word sat in the air between them for a while. Not heavy, but meaningful. She didn't rush to respond. She reached for the loaf of bread and cut another slice. "Then I guess we better make sure it stays strong enough for both of us." They both smiled. Later that week, they started building a small shed next to the cabin. It wasn't big, just enough to store tools and supplies. But the work brought something new: shared sweat, shared laughs, shared silence under the open sky. At night, they would sit by the fire, and sometimes he would read aloud from a book he had brought. Sometimes she would read one of the notes she kept in her jar, the thoughts she had written during the quiet days before he ever knocked on her door. Some notes were simple, like, "Today the wind sounded like a song." Others were heavier. "I don't know if I'm meant to be alone forever." She shared them without fear now, and he never judged. He just listened, and sometimes that was all she needed. One evening after a day of work in the garden, he asked her something that caught her off guard. "Do you think you'll ever leave this place?" Eleanor looked out toward the trees. The forest swayed gently in the late light. Birds called out somewhere in the distance. "I used to think I couldn't," she said slowly, "that if I left I'd lose something I'd worked hard to protect. But now, I don't know. Maybe it's not about leaving. Maybe it's about not being afraid to live wherever life takes you." He nodded, understanding what she meant. "I think about that too," he said, "not running from things anymore, just going toward something instead." There was a pause. Then Eleanor said, "Whatever comes next, I don't think I'll face it alone." The fire crackled. The night wrapped around the cabin like an old friend. Weeks passed, and one day he brought a map. "I've been thinking," he said, "what if we plan a small trip? Just a few days. See what's beyond this part of the forest?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow, half amused. "And who will feed the goats?" He chuckled. "We'll leave enough food. It's only a short trip." She looked at the map, then at him. And for the first time in a long time, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Curiosity. A sense of wonder. A spark of adventure. "All right," she said. "Let's do it." And they did. They packed lightly, just enough for a few days. They followed trails she hadn't walked since her husband was alive. The woods looked different now, but the feeling was familiar. Fresh air, soft moss beneath their feet. The way the trees seemed to lean in like they were listening. They found an old lake she had almost forgotten. Still clear and untouched, she stood by the edge of the water, quiet. "I came here once," she said, "when I was younger, before everything changed. And now you're here again," he said, standing beside her, "but not alone this time." She looked at him and he took her hand gently, respectfully. No rush, no pressure, just warmth and presence. That night they camped beneath the stars. No roof, no walls, just sky above and earth below. "I think you were right," he said, voice low in the dark. "You are bigger than that cabin." Eleanor turned her head to him, her voice steady. "Maybe, but that cabin is where I found myself again." They didn't need to say more. The silence between them said enough. When they returned to the cabin days later, everything was the same, but nothing felt exactly the same. The door creaked as always. The goats bleated, asking for food. The fire needed to be lit again. But the space inside her felt wider, more open, full of light. That night, she wrote something in her notebook. "You can still be rooted and grow. You can still stay and explore. The heart has room for both." Seasons would continue to come and go. There would be hard winters and long rains. But now she knew she didn't have to face any of it in silence. She had a voice again. She had someone who heard it. And no matter where life would take them next, the cabin would always be their starting place, not an ending, not a hiding spot, but a home. It didn't need to be bigger. They just needed to be brave enough to fill it. And they were, together. The sun was slowly setting, casting long shadows over the forest that surrounded the cabin. Eleanor sat on the porch, her hands busy weaving small baskets from willow branches. The sound of the nearby creek was soft and steady, a gentle reminder that life went on even when it felt still. The man was inside, fixing the old wooden chair that had cracked last winter. Every now and then, she could hear his soft humming as he worked. It was a quiet moment, but it held a certain peace that neither of them had expected to find when their paths first crossed. Over time, the cabin had become more than just a shelter from the storm. It was a place where two brooks and souls had found a way to heal. Not quickly or easily, but through small moments like this, simple, honest, and full of understanding. Eleanor thought about how much had changed. Just months ago, the thought of someone else living here, sharing this space, had seemed impossible. Now it felt natural, as if the cabin had been waiting for company all along. She looked out toward the trees and saw a pair of birds building a nest. Life continued even in the quietest places. That gave her hope. One evening, after a dinner of roasted vegetables and fresh bread, they sat by the fire and talked about dreams they had almost forgotten. "I used to think I wanted to leave this place behind," Eleanor admitted. "But now I'm not so sure." The man looked at her thoughtfully. "What changed?" She smiled softly. "I realize that sometimes the place we think is holding us back is actually holding us together." He nodded, understanding more than words could say. As the days grew warmer, they started planning small adventures, exploring the woods beyond the usual paths, visiting the nearby village for fresh supplies, and even helping neighbors with simple chores. Eleanor found herself laughing more, feeling a lightness that she hadn't known in years. One afternoon, while walking through a field of wildflowers, they came across an old, abandoned barn. It was weathered and worn, but something about it called to them. "Maybe this could be our next project," the man said, eyes bright with excitement. Eleanor hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I like that idea." Together they spent weeks restoring the barn. It wasn't easy, but the work brought them closer. With each nail hammered and each plank repaired, they built not just a structure, but a future. The barn became a symbol, a reminder that even things broken and forgotten could be made whole again. One chilly evening, as snow began to fall softly outside, they sat inside the barn, warmed by a small fire. Eleanor looked around and realized how far she had come, from a life of solitude and fear to one filled with friendship and hope. The man reached out and took her hand. "You've taught me that home isn't just a place. It's a feeling." She squeezed his hand gently. "And you've reminded me that I'm not as small as I once thought." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white. Inside, two hearts were quietly growing together, strong enough to face whatever storms might come. And in that moment, Eleanor knew that no matter what happened next, she would never be alone again. The days grew longer, and the forest seemed to wake up with a gentle energy. Birds returned, filling the air with songs that Eleanor hadn't heard in a long time. The cabin in the barn, once silent and still, now felt alive with possibility. Eleanor spent mornings tending to her garden, watching the new shoots break through the soil. The man worked nearby, fixing tools and planning the next steps for their small farm. Their lives were quiet, but full. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned pink, Eleanor sat on the porch, looking out over the fields. She thought about how much her life had changed since the stormy night when the man first appeared at her door. Back then, she was alone and afraid. Now she felt strong and hopeful. The man joined her, carrying 2 cups of tea. He handed one to Eleanor and sat beside her. For a while, they watched the colors fade from the sky without saying a word. The quiet between them was comfortable, filled with shared understanding. Finally, he spoke. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" Eleanor took a slow sip of her tea. "Sometimes, but I don't worry like I used to." He smiled gently. "That's good." She looked at him, the fading light catching the warmth in his eyes. "I've learned that life isn't about waiting for the storm to pass. It's about learning to dance in the rain." He nodded, and for the first time there was a softness in his voice. "I think you're teaching me that." Their days became a rhythm, work, rest, and moments of quiet joy. They fixed fences, planted trees, and watched the animals grow. The barn was almost finished, standing proudly as a symbol of their hard work and new beginnings. One day, Eleanor found an old photo tucked in a drawer in the cabin. It showed a younger version of herself, smiling with someone she loved and lost. She held the picture gently, remembering the past but not letting it hold her back. That night, she shared the photo with the man. "I used to think I had to carry everything on my own." He looked at the photo, then at her. "You don't have to anymore." She smiled, a quiet strength in her eyes. "No, I don't." As spring turned into summer, they began inviting neighbors over for small gatherings, shared meals, stories, laughter that echoed through the trees. The cabin, once a place of solitude, became a place of connection. One evening, under a sky full of stars, they sat around a fire with friends. Eleanor looked around, feeling the warmth of the flames and the people around her. She realized that she had found something even better than safety. It was belonging. The man leaned over and whispered, "You've built more than a home here." Eleanor nodded. "We've built a life." And in that moment she knew that no matter what storms might come, she was no longer just the woman in the small cabin. She was part of something bigger, something stronger. She was ready for whatever came next. The summer days slowly began to fade into early autumn. The forest, once full of bright green, started to show hints of gold and red. Eleanor could feel the change in the air, the soft chill that told her the year was turning. The cabin, the barn, the little garden, it all felt alive and growing, just like she was. She spent mornings walking through the woods, watching the leaves fall like gentle rain. The man often joined her, and together they discovered new paths, quiet streams, and hidden clearings. The forest no longer felt like a place to hide from the world. It was a place to find peace and wonder. One afternoon, as the sunlight filtered through the branches, Eleanor stopped to pick up a smooth stone by the creek. She held it in her palm, feeling its cool weight. It reminded her that some things in life were small but steady, things you could carry with you. Back at the cabin, they sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and earth. The man spoke quietly. "I've been thinking about the future. Not just the next season, but what comes after." Eleanor looked at him, curiosity and hope shining in her eyes. "What do you see?" He smiled softly. "I see a life built slowly, day by day. A life where we can be ourselves, where we don't have to run or hide." She nodded, feeling that same hope stirring inside her. A life that isn't just about surviving, but about living. Their conversations grew deeper, filled with dreams and plans. They talked about fixing up the barn to use it as a workshop, growing more food, maybe even welcoming others who needed a safe place to rest. Eleanor realized she was no longer afraid of the future. The past still lived in her heart, but it no longer controlled her. She was learning to live with both the joy and the pain. One evening, as they prepared dinner, Eleanor found herself humming a song she hadn't heard in years. It was soft and simple, but it made her smile. The man listened and said, "I like that song." "It's one my mother used to sing," she said. "It reminds me of hope." They ate quietly, the firelight flickering around them. Outside, the first stars appeared, bright and steady. Over the following weeks, they worked side by side, fixing fences, planting trees, and sharing stories under the sky. The barn became more than just a building. It was a symbol of second chances and new beginnings. One cold morning, as frost covered the ground, Eleanor stood outside and looked up at the sky. She thought about how far she had come, from a woman afraid and alone to someone who had found friendship, strength, and hope. The man joined her, wrapping a warm blanket around her shoulders. "You're stronger than you know," he said softly. She smiled, feeling the warmth not just from the blanket but from the words themselves. "I'm learning." Together they faced the coming winter, ready for whatever it might bring. The cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was a home filled with light, laughter, and love. And Eleanor knew, no matter the storms ahead, she would never be alone again. The winter was long and quiet. Snow covered the ground, turning the forest into a white blanket. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled softly, filling the space with warmth. Eleanor sat close to the hearth, hands wrapped around a mug of tea. The light flickered on her face as she watched the flames dance. Outside, the world was still, but inside the cabin there was a quiet energy. The man was busy organizing tools in the barn, preparing for the spring work ahead. Though the days were short and cold, they had found a rhythm, a steady beat that carried them through the season. Eleanor thought back to the first days she had spent alone in the cabin. Those were times filled with silence and fear, when the cold seemed to seep not just through the walls but into her heart. Now the cold was different. It was a season to rest, to reflect, and to prepare. One evening, as the wind howled outside, the man came inside with a stack of old books. He placed them gently on the table and smiled. "I thought we could read together," he said. "Stories to keep us warm." Eleanor nodded, grateful for the small comfort. They took turns reading, voices soft but full of life. The words carried them to places beyond the forest, cities bustling with people, seas stretching to the horizon, mountains touched by clouds. For a while, the cabin felt like a vessel carrying them far from their worries. Between the stories, they talked about dreams and fears. Eleanor shared thoughts she hadn't spoken aloud before. The man listened without judgment, offering kindness instead. One night, as snowflakes drifted past the window, Eleanor said, "I used to believe I had to face everything alone. Now I see that sharing the weight makes it lighter." He reached out and took her hand, his grip steady. "We're stronger together." The winter stretched on, but neither of them felt trapped. Instead, they found strength in the quiet moments, the shared warmth, the gentle conversations, the small acts of kindness. When the snow finally began to melt, the forest woke again with the promise of new life. Eleanor and the man stepped outside, feeling the earth soft beneath their feet. They looked at the cabin, the barn, the garden beginning to stir. Together, they planned the year ahead, planting seeds, repairing fences, welcoming the changing seasons with open hearts. Eleanor smiled, thinking of how much had changed since that first stormy night. She no longer feared the future. She had learned to trust in herself and in the quiet power of friendship. As spring arrived, the cabin stood strong and warm, a place of hope, healing and new beginnings, and Eleanor knew, no matter where life took her next, she was ready. The warmth of spring had fully settled over the land. Flowers bloomed in bright colors, and the trees were lush with new leaves. Eleanor felt a deep sense of peace as she stepped outside the cabin, breathing in the fresh air. The sounds of birds singing and bees buzzing filled the morning, promising new beginnings. The man was already in the garden, digging into the rich earth to prepare the soil for planting. He looked up and smiled when he saw Eleanor approaching. Together, they began planting seeds, small, fragile beginnings that held the promise of growth and life. Days passed with the simple joy of working side by side. The barn was now fully repaired, standing proudly at the edge of the clearing, ready to shelter tools and hope alike. The garden grew slowly, leaves stretching toward the sun. Each sprout was a reminder that life could start over no matter the past. One afternoon, Eleanor sat quietly on the porch, watching clouds drift lazily across the sky. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, how much she had learned about herself, about trust, and about the power of connection. The man joined her with 2 cups of cold lemonade. They sat together, sipping in comfortable silence, letting the peace settle between them. She finally spoke, her voice soft but sure. "Do you ever think about what we've built? Not just the cabin or the barn, but this?" He looked at her, eyes warm and steady. "Every day. It's more than I ever imagined." Eleanor smiled, feeling a surge of gratitude. "I was so afraid before. Afraid of what might happen, afraid of being alone." He nodded. "But you found courage." She looked away, thinking of the nights when fear had kept her awake. "More than courage, I found hope." Together, they began planning for the months ahead. They talked about planting more, maybe raising a few animals and helping neighbors in need. The small community around them was growing, slowly but surely, just like the garden. One evening, as the sun set behind the trees, they sat by the fire outside the barn. The sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, the air cool and clear. Eleanor took a deep breath and said, "I never thought I'd feel this way again, so calm, so certain." The man reached out and took her hand. "We're stronger because we're together." In that moment, Eleanor knew the truth of those words. No matter what storms came in the future, she wouldn't face them alone. She had found a home, not just a place, but a person, a life full of promise, and for the first time in a long time, she was ready to embrace whatever came next. The warm days of summer slowly gave way to the softer light of early autumn. The air was cooler now, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and ripe fruit. Eleanor woke each morning with a feeling she hadn't known in a long time, a quiet joy that came from living fully in the moment. She stepped outside the cabin and breathed deeply, feeling the sun on her face and the earth beneath her feet. The garden was flourishing, bursting with colors and life. The man was already working near the barn, repairing a broken fence to keep the animals safe. Their days were filled with purpose and simple tasks that brought them closer to the life they were building together. One afternoon, Eleanor sat by the creek, watching the water flow over smooth stones. She thought about the journey that had led her here, from a place of fear and loneliness to a life filled with hope and connection. The man joined her, sitting quietly beside her, sharing the peaceful moment. She looked at him and said, "I never imagined that I could feel this safe, this happy." He smiled gently. "Neither did I. But sometimes life surprises us when we least expect it." Their bond had grown strong through shared struggles and quiet victories. They understood each other without needing many words, a connection deeper than they had ever known before. As the days grew shorter, they prepared the cabin for the coming winter. They gathered firewood, stored food, and made plans for the months ahead. Despite the work, there was laughter and warmth between them, a reminder that life was about more than just survival. One evening, they invited a few neighbors over for a simple meal. Around the fire, stories were shared and new friendships were made. Eleanor felt a deep sense of belonging, knowing she was part of something bigger than herself. After the guests had left, she and the man sat together under the stars. The quiet night was filled with a sense of peace and possibility. "I'm ready for whatever comes next," she said softly. He took her hand, his eyes reflecting the light of the fire. "We'll face it together." And in that moment, Eleanor knew that she had found her home, not just the cabin or the barn or the land, but the life they had created side by side. No matter what the future held, she was ready. Because she was no longer alone. The days grew shorter, and the air started to carry a sharpness that reminded Eleanor winter was coming again. The trees around the cabin turned brilliant shades of orange, red, and gold. Leaves fell softly to the ground, creating a colorful blanket that crunched beneath her feet. She and the man were busy preparing for the cold months ahead. They gathered wood, stored extra food, and fixed any weak spots in the cabin and barn. It was hard work, but they worked together, and the chores became moments of connection instead of burdens. One evening, after a long day, Eleanor sat on the porch, wrapped in a warm blanket. The sky was a deep purple and the stars began to twinkle. The man joined her with 2 cups of hot cider. They sipped quietly, the warmth from the drink matching the quiet comfort between them. "I can't believe how far we've come," Eleanor said softly. "It feels like a different life from the one I had before." He nodded, looking out at the darkening forest. "It's been a journey. But I'm glad we didn't give up," Eleanor smiled. "Neither am I." They talked about the past, not to dwell on it, but to understand how it shaped them. The struggles, the fears, and the moments of courage all came together like pieces of a puzzle. Each piece was important, but none defined who they were now. The firelight flickered as they shared stories and dreams for the future. They talked about planting more trees, building a small greenhouse, and maybe even starting a family someday. Eleanor felt a deep peace in those dreams, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it side by side. As the first snowflakes fell quietly outside, she realized that the cabin was more than just a shelter. It was a home built on trust, hope, and the simple strength of 2 people choosing to walk together. And in that home, Eleanor found a kind of happiness she hadn't thought possible before.